Good morning, everyone. I'm assuming everybody can hear me okay. Welcome, and I'm delighted to see so many journalists here today. I'm Catherine Noble, and I'm the Climate Initiative Manager at the Solutions Journalism Network. I want to welcome you all to our session today, which is part of both our Climate Beacon Newsroom Initiative and our Climate Primer series, which are webinars designed to bring climate journalists the latest, most reliable information available to use in their reporting across beats on solutions to the climate crisis. Next slide. For those of you who aren't familiar with SJN, we are a national nonprofit organization that supports and trains editors and reporters on the practice of solutions journalism, which we define as rigorous reporting on responses to social and environmental problems. Nowhere is solutions journalism more important than reporting on the climate crisis. Yet the media has largely failed to report the whole climate story, focusing almost entirely on the severity of the crisis, which is crucial, but leaving out rigorous examination of how businesses, governments, nonprofits, and communities are responding. We hope that what you learned today will help you do more and better climate solutions reporting. Next slide. I'm really excited to introduce two leading experts on climate science and climate solutions here with us today. Bernadette Placky of Climate Central and Jonathan Foley of Project Drawdown. The format today is that each of our speakers will spend about 25 minutes on climate science and data and frameworks, and the resources and experts available to you at their respective organizations. I will be monitoring the chat during their presentations, and so as questions come up for you, please post them there. I will select questions to present to our speakers in the last 10 minutes of today's sessions, and what we don't get to, we will respond to in a follow-up email next week. So to our speakers, Bernadette Placky is an Emmy Award-winning meteorologist and director of Climate Central's Climate Matters. Climate Central communicates climate change science, effects, and solutions to the public and to decision makers. Through their Climate Matters program, they offer data analysis, graphics, and other reporting resources to a growing network of local TV meteorologists and journalists, helping them tell their local climate stories. In her leadership role at Climate Central, Woods Placky develops partnerships with media organizations, nonprofits, and academic institutions, and she serves as an expert on the links between climate change and weather. And next slide, we world-renowned environmental scientist, director of Project Drawdown, solution and more than 130 peer-reviewed, many highly cited works in Science, Nature, and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He and his colleagues have made major contributions Did you lose me there for a second?
Catherine, you started to, I was just starting to chat you. You froze a little bit and we lost you.
Okay, where did you lose me?
In you describing how amazing Jonathan is.
Okay, I'll keep going with how amazing Jonathan is. Foley has published. He's published in National Geographic, the New York Times, the Guardian. He's taught at several major universities. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn the microphone over to you, Bernadette.
All right, thank you. And thank you for bringing us all together today and for so many people who have logged in. This is fantastic. We know we have a mix of you joining us today from people who have been pretty expert climate reporters for a while, and we hope we can add new to what you're learning and what you're reporting on here. But there's also a lot of new people who are joining us today too. So what I'm going to do is share my screen here and get us started and really ground us on some basics when it comes to climate science and how that's affecting us and where we can go with reporting resources, then hand it over to Jonathan, who will dive even more into the solutions that exist already today and what we can do about that. So, our changing climate. Many of you have seen this, but not everyone. And this is the foundation for so much of what we do. Yale and George Mason University have been doing this research twice a year, going back to 2008, really helping us understand where is the public on this issue. Because not only is there a lot of misinformation around climate change itself, but there's a lot of mis and disinformation on what we think about this as a society. And so really to frame it and help you understand your audience, you see that the vast majority of people are interested in this subject. What they don't know, though, is what that means to them and what can be done about it. Over here, all the way on the right, the dismissive, when you read this research, you'll see that's the group that you're really probably not going to break through with, but it's only about 10% of our population. They just have a really loud voice on social media and certain forms of media. So really to ground this conversation, most of what we're talking about is 90% of the population, which consumes news and wants to know, and really is interested, but just has a lot of questions. So when you break that down across the country, they've also taken this data and downscaled it. And you can see that the vast majority of the country thinks that climate change is happening. You only see a couple of counties there that drop into the blue, which is below 50%. But this is another thing too, just so you can go and explore. If you Google the Yale Climate Opinion Maps, you'll see that there's a whole host of questions that they ask, and you can really start to dive into different topics with respect to climate change and where your audience is. And you'll see overwhelmingly there's support for renewable energy and some of the policies around that, but you start to drop off these numbers when we talk about human causation, what does this mean to me, and what we can do about it. So I wanted to highlight these two maps here because I think this is really important. This number is actually up. This is the percent of the population that hears about global warming in the media at least once a week. That number is up to 33%. And on the counter of that, this is the group that wants to hear more about it. And there's even a series of questions around this specific research that they did on climate reporting. And overwhelmingly, every topic they asked about, it was 10 different questions, the numbers came in at 70% or higher. So that shows you people have a lot of questions and they're looking for someone to help answer these questions. So we're going to help ground you in what's going on so you can help answer those questions and build your audience. The same researchers put this together. It's the quickest summary that you'll see. It's real. It's us. Experts agree. It's serious, but there's hope. So let's get into that. The greenhouse effect. This is science that goes back to the 1800s. Nobody challenges this. We know what greenhouse gases are. We know that they trap heat within them. We know we're putting more into the atmosphere, and we can actually measure that. Now, Jonathan's going to get more into this, but I'm putting this up here to help with the story so we can continue to build on it. And it doesn't hurt to hear this part twice. This is where our emissions come from. And I have two different graphs up here because the US is slightly different than the rest of the world. I know we have people joining us from both the US and globally. So in the US, you'll see our biggest sectors are transportation, whereas globally, that transportation number is down and the land use is up a little bit more. But overall, you see energy, transportation, land use, agriculture, and our buildings are some of our biggest forms of emission here. Primarily when we burn coal, oil, and gas, and we put that into our atmosphere somehow. Now, the other thing too is we can measure this and we can track it, and we know that it directly correlates to temperature. So when you put that in perspective globally here in Celsius, because remember when we talk globally, we talk about that goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius. We're at about 1.1, 1.2 degrees Celsius already from our pre-industrial time frame here. So what does that mean? That means the fact that greenhouse gases stay in our atmosphere for a long time, that we've already baked in some future warming, and we have to make changes quickly. But the good news is a lot of these responses and solutions exist. We just need to accelerate and scale them. So we're going to get into that. Now, why is this so serious? What is a couple of degrees anyway, right? We shift a couple of degrees every day where we live. Well, look at this. We learned a lot about bell curves during COVID, right? So when you shift that average slightly, it puts us in a whole new climate zone. Look, it's so much more red and so much less blue. Now you see there still is blue. There's still cold. It's going to happen. There's so much more red that happens in this new climate zone that we're living in. And this is how it translates directly into heat. It is shifting us from different states. Here's an example of an analysis we did. Columbus, Ohio, looking forward to 2100, your summers are going to feel like Little Rock, Arkansas. But we're already seeing that. Look at Denver, days above 90 degrees. This is when we really have to shift our living patterns, right? We're already seeing almost a month of that. And that's not translating equally. This is very unequal. And this is a major equity story too, because we're seeing this concentration of extra heat in cities where it directly aligns with red line districting from back in the day. We're just not seeing as many trees to cool and shade our areas, and it makes for healthier communities. We're also seeing less cold on the opposite of that. Another thing with our weather is that the more heat we add to our atmosphere, remember, we're mainly a water planet here, we are evaporating more moisture into that atmosphere, and it translates into bigger buckets of rain when it comes down, or when it's still cold enough, more snow. And we're seeing that happen around the country. It's more highlighted in the upper Midwest and the Northeast, but you see even places that are drying out overall, it's how we're getting that rain. And when it's coming in these bigger buckets. But on the opposite side, when you evaporate more, it exacerbates droughts. Now, I do know this graph itself only goes to 2020 right here. And we know that this year we've taken a major dent in that Western drought, which is phenomenal news. But you see the overall pattern. We have to really celebrate years like this outside of the flooding. I mean, it did come with the other side of that, but it is helping the drought. But when we get these more intense droughts, what that does is set the stage for bigger, more explosive wildfires too, which worsens air quality. And that's just our atmosphere. 90% of our extra heat is going into our oceans, and that is playing out in some big ways. Weather-wise, it's supercharging our tropical systems. They're getting more explosive. They are intensifying more rapidly, and when they do make landfall, they bring more rain with them and a higher storm surge from sea level rise. The other thing too, though, with our oceans is it's really changing the ecosystems of our oceans. What fish are where and when and how, and it's also taking a huge toll on our corals. So we're seeing these disasters. They're happening more frequently and they're compounding. They're happening, there's not as much time in between them for communities to recover and rebuild in smart ways. So this is really taking a toll, and it's costing a lot of money, lives and livelihoods here. So there's this new form of science. It's really 2 decades old at this point, but it's rapidly evolving, and it's called attribution science. For those who haven't been following along, essentially what it is you can go into individual events and tease out the role of climate change within that event. So historically, climate is what you would expect, weather is what you would get. Now, climate is what you're affecting, and it's changing our weather. And so it's really not a question of cause. And this is, I'm highlighting this for our journalists because we get a little confused on this. These events were going to happen anyway, even without climate change. But what we're learning with attribution science is how much more likely, how much more intense. It's really changing the form of that event. So the first study was done in 2003. Well, the 2003 heat wave published in 2004, so about 20 years here. And this was in Nature. And it looked at the European heat wave that took thousands and thousands of extra lives here. And between our understanding of the science and technology and computing power, we're able to tease out that role. And it showed that climate change made that event much worse. And so what has happened as this science has evolved is the National Academies, which is the big body that takes a snapshot of the science, really looks at all the research that's out there and assesses it, put out this report in 2016. And I know there's a lot of words, but I wanted to highlight this for you too, because sometimes people are still falling into this saying we can't attribute any one event to climate change, but that's not the case anymore. We can. The science has moved past that point that we can now do that. And so World Weather Attribution is a great organization led by Freddie Otto. And what they do, and Climate Central, we helped start this a few years ago, but Freddie is rocking this now. What they do is they take on some of these big events around the world, and they can assess the role of climate change within those. And they just had a new report come out this week about the heat in South Asia in April. And so you can go to World Weather Attribution, take a look at this study and all of the studies. They're putting out about at least one a month at this point. And as we all know, these events are coming fast and furious. So the other thing they did, which is really great, is they created a reporting guide for journalists. So if you go to their site and go under the resources tab, you will be able to find this. It's mainly around heat, other events though too, but it shows you that almost all of these big heat events are attributable to climate change. That's where we are right now. So Climate Central, we are working with World Weather Attribution, and between continued knowledge about the science and continued advancement in technology, we're now at the point where we can look at individual temperatures daily around the globe. I have the US map here. I didn't realize how many global people we'd have, sorry, but we do have a global map. And we can look at the role of climate change within those of daily temperatures. And here's a snapshot for tomorrow. I zoned in on low temperatures and look at across the West. That is a fingerprint of climate change on low temperatures right now across the West. You also see a little bit of gray across the East. We had that strong cold front that came through, and it's bringing in some cooler air, and it's showing you that nights like this are so much less likely with climate change, and they will be even more rare as we go forward. So it's not just these extreme events and these daily changes we're seeing, but how that translates into daily life. Climate change is affecting our health in some major ways. We're seeing more mosquito days. We're seeing poison ivy just exploding. Air quality is a major issue. We have made so many advancements with our air quality and the Clean Air Act in the United States. But the thing is, these spikes in wildfires that we're getting are challenging the advances that we've made. And we're seeing that right now up in Canada. If we have anyone from Canada with us, the wildfires, I am so sorry you're going through those right now. And that smoke is spreading all the way across the continent, and it's heading over toward Europe in some cases here too. And it is taking a toll, and it's worsening air quality. The other thing too is we're seeing our allergy seasons just explode. They're getting longer and they're getting worse. So there's many ways that this is affecting our health and our economies. Our energy, it's increasing cooling demand. It is also leading to more power outages, especially as our grid gets more dated. We're seeing it affect some of our ways of life and some of our favorite beverages like beer and coffee, and outdoor events that we go to are getting hotter, and people are now having to plan around those. Look what happened with the Olympic trials with track and field just a couple of years ago, that coincided with the Pacific Northwest Heat Dome. And people who train their entire life for these events, the top athletes in the world, had to do their heats overnight. I mean, this is taking big tolls on society on many different levels. And sadly, it's affecting so many things here. And the reason we put all of these up is because one of the ways you can advance your climate reporting is connecting your current stories with what's happening with climate change and how that's changing. Because unfortunately, there is a climate angle to all of these things that you see here: our weather, our food, our water, health, economy, equity, social justice, infrastructure, transportation, energy. It's shifting our ecosystems, our seasons, national security, migration. A lot of what we're seeing at our borders is because of drought in other countries and people being forced away from their farms and their homelands. Tourism, sports, lifestyle activities, and ways of life. So there's a lot of challenges with climate change, and that's why you are in such an opportunity to help people understand and help them be prepared and informed. But there's also opportunities, and that's one of the reasons we're here today too, is to really get into those. And I'm only going to touch on a couple because Jonathan's going to do a whole lot more here, but we've got a couple of tools that we can also help you with your daily reporting, even locally here. So Weather Power is a tool that we created because weather isn't just an impact anymore, it's also a solution. One of the ways we're seeing just race forward is the increase in solar and wind energy, creating healthier communities, creating new jobs. And there's a weather power tool which will spit out, if you pick a geography, how much wind and solar is being generated today in your community. Now, we also have a whole solution series we've been putting together. And so it's stored on our website. And there's a lot of different briefs and Climate Matters reports that we've put together here. One is coming up on oceans soon. It's, just looking at the calendar, June 7th. And so on June 7th, we have an ocean solutions report coming out, coinciding with World Oceans Day, which is June 8th. So Jonathan's going to do a lot more on that part of it, but there are tools out there to help you do this. So what we've learned in this process, know your audience. It is so critical. People are really interested in learning more and learning what they can do about it. So tone, topic, timing, the power of local and personal. And you can take a big global issue, but how you feel it personally and locally. And you have such an opportunity to really dive into that. Simplify, drop the jargon. You're learning a lot here. This is fantastic, but there's still a disconnect from climate communities and how we talk about climate change and what the public understands. And so there's an ability to help translate that for them. There's a story for every beat here, and the power of storytelling. You guys are masters at that. Incorporate responses and solutions. People want to know what comes next, what can be done, what are we doing to prepare? And don't be afraid. Don't overthink this. Science and public opinion is on your side. So a couple of quick resources before I hand it back over. Here's a snapshot of our weekly Climate Matters. I'm going to leave you with a QR code in just a moment, and I'll put a link also in the chat. But sign up for our Climate Matters. Sign up and start getting this content. We put it out at least weekly. The thing is, we are doing additional alerts now around our weekly package of content. We do all of this in Spanish translation, as you can see. And this is one of really the power of urban trees. And I mean, who doesn't love trees, right? So they make cleaner air, they lower your energy bills, and also they can help absorb rain runoff. So it limits flooding. And so there's a whole one that we just did recently here. But the other thing too is we're seeing with our attribution tools we get, especially into heat season, we've created a unit internally called the Heat Squad that's looking at some of these events, at the climate fingerprint on these events already, and getting those alerts out. So if you want those, sign up for Climate Matters and we'll get you that. It's free, it's local. We also have, for anyone who's coastal, we have a global sea level rise tool. It is fantastic. If you are not coastal, I understand this is not your thing. If you are coastal, there is so much data and information in here. We have over 110 data sets of what would be underwater, what ways, at what times. And also, the other thing is it really looks at, we've done reports really pulling out, affordable housing units underwater, all of that kind of a thing. But this also, we've done a lot of visuals on this too, so it can help you with your storytelling there. And then partnership journalism. And this is my colleague, John Upton, who's worked with a lot of the people in the Climate Beacons project here too. It's where we will work with you. It's a collaboration as collaborative journalism is exploding, right? A way to really dive deeper into a data set and help bring out the faces and the voices from that community. So if you're interested in doing some partnership journalism stories on our, either you can email me and I'll connect you with John, or on our website, you can explore some of what he's done already. Some great stories he's already doing with some of the SJN Beacon Fellows. And need to also call this out because Solutions Journalism Network has also put together this guide with Covering Climate Now, which is a guide to getting into solutions journalism and some ways that you can think through this and incorporate this into your work. So there's some incredible resources out there. If you go to Covering Climate Now, you can sign up for their newsletter and you can also access this guide. So I have a snapshot of tons of resources, get to know in your local community. So many of our government hubs have really good data and info, and they want to work with people from USDA, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Service, EPA, regional climate centers. Your local universities are on the front edge of understanding what's going on. Get to know them. You'll know the stories as they're coming out before they come out. Covering Climate Now, Local Media Association, both have climate units to really dive in and work with this stuff even more deeply. Sciline, this, and I know I'm going fast, but I have limited time and I will share these slides. Sciline is an organization that does matching with experts on scientific topics on a timely basis. So they're fantastic. They also have quick facts on different ways of reporting for guidelines. If you're just getting started, Skeptical Science will debunk any of the myths out there. And there's so many climate newsletters at this point. So one last thing before I give you the QR code here. On June 21st, if you don't know this design, get to know it. It's called the Warming Stripes or Show Your Stripes. Ed Hawkins, he's a scientist over in the UK, and he created this design, and it's a fascinating design. I mean, what it shows is not so good, but every stripe is a global temperature anomaly. And what you see on the left with the blue is when we were below average, and you see how quickly that goes up to the reds. But this is a conversation starter, and there are some challenging things that we have to deal with climate change, but people love this design. And so we've worked with Ed, and every year now on June 21st, and the reason we've landed on that day is it's the kickoff of the Northern Hemisphere summer and the biggest extremes that we see. And so use this as an opportunity for storytelling and news hook to go to engage in a solution story or your community or start a climate conversation. So there's a lot you can do. We want you to take this day and own it and do something big with it yourself. So here is the link to sign up for Climate Matters. You can get started right away. We have over 10 years of content bookmarked on our website if you want to start diving through some of our resources. And again, like I said, I will put this link in our chat because my time is now running out and I have to hand it over to Jonathan. So thank you so much for joining us, everyone. All right, Jonathan, you are on mute.
I sound a lot smarter when I'm on mute. So anyway, I was thanking Bernadette for the great presentation, and it's always fun to work with her on these kinds of things. So yeah, following that great overview of kind of where climate science is today on kind of diagnosing the state of the climate and what's going on with our climate system. I work for an organization called Project Drawdown that focuses really on the solutions to the crisis. What we can do to stop climate change. And, you're all reporters and, covered this topic so wonderfully. But I think that sometimes we lose sight of the fact that we're really actually in a race now between two very different futures. One future gets a lot of attention, the future where we get it wrong, where we don't stop climate change and it runs into the catastrophic range of impact, which we're beginning to see the early days of today, but it could be so much worse, where climate change gets much larger, much more impactful, and especially amongst the most vulnerable people and ecosystems on the planet. We don't want that future, clearly. But there is another future out there that is entirely possible. And in fact, I think it's more and more likely every day. I've been working on climate change for about 30 years now, and I've actually never been more optimistic about the future of stopping this problem. Because new technologies, new policies, new markets, new movements are working and growing exponentially. It's been a long time coming. These things are definitely been slow so far, and we're not out of the woods by any stretch of the imagination. But I really believe we have a real shot now, a real chance to stop climate change, and it's an honest to God race. And we can win this race between these two different futures. But to do that, we're going to have to do some important things. And one of them, of course, is to help cut through all the noise and all the confusion out there about climate solutions and follow some basic science. Just like we did when it comes to the climate problem, we have to do the same thing when it comes to solutions. So when I think about the future of the world and fixing it, I think about Matt Damon. You probably do too. And, he's just in every movie, right? And I love him in this movie called The Martian, where, if you remember the movie, he's stranded on Mars all by himself, and he's trying to figure out how to survive all by himself. Well, luckily, he's trained in science. He's a scientist himself. And his character says something really great. He says, well, you just begin. You do the math. You solve one problem, and then you solve the next one, and then the next. And my favorite quote in the whole movie is this. He says, you only have one option. You're going to have to science the shit out of this. Well, that's what we're going to have to do with climate change too, because we have listened to science about the problem of climate change. In fact, we formed probably the biggest assemblage of scientists in human history. The IPCC involved tens of thousands of scientific and engineering experts from around the world for 3 decades, more than the Manhattan Project, more than Apollo. A huge focus of the world scientific community to determine, is science saying that climate change is real? What's causing it? How bad is it going to be? What's it doing today? And we can see how that science has paid off. And Bernadette's presentation showed us handsomely exactly what science is telling us about our changing climate. But when it comes to solutions, it kind of seems like we stopped listening to the scientist, and we're listening to just kind of any random person on Facebook or something. Here are a few examples of everybody's ideas about stopping climate change. We listen to tech bros, we listen to celebrities, we listen to investors. None of these people have taken one course ever in climate change, and we think that they actually know what to do. Well, not really, because to solve the problem that's inherently kind of a science-oriented problem, we better learn a little science first. And that's what I want to show you today, about how can we use science to kind of guide us towards the best solutions. Well, here are a few things we have to figure out first. First, of course, is there's more than one greenhouse gas. It isn't just CO2. CO2 is very important, and we're going to talk about that, but we also have methane, which is extremely important, especially in the near term on climate change. But we also have critical greenhouse gases like nitrous oxide and fluorinated gases and lots of different things. And they come from multiple sources. It's not just fossil fuels. That's also a big misconstruction. For example, if we look at where greenhouse gases come from, we can see how emissions from fossil fuels show up as a big part of the equation. Here we can see, for example, it's, why is this stopping here? There we go. That CO2 coming from fossil fuels actually causes less than 60% of the warming we're seeing today. It's about 58% of human-caused climate change is CO2 from fossil fuels. But that's usually all we talk about. But over 40% of the answer is other gases and other processes. For example, the fossil fuel industry, of course, produces methane as well as CO2. For some reason, my slides are freezing up here. I'm going to just have to click through them, I guess. So we have methane from CO2 here. Methane from the fossil fuel industry here. This is kind of fugitive emissions of methane, which is also known as natural gas, or flaring of methane intentionally. So this is still fossil fuels, but a very different gas. We also have nitrous oxide produced when we burn hydrocarbons. Sometimes it also forms this other greenhouse gas called nitrous oxide. But what altogether, fossil fuels are contributing about 2/3 of the climate change we're seeing today. The remaining third comes from other things, basically industrial chemistry and agriculture. For example, making cement and steel and glass and processing waste also releases carbon dioxide, methane, fluorinated gases, and nitrous oxide. And then we have agriculture and land use, which also emits a whole bunch from deforestation and other things. We release carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide from agriculture. So I just want people to know that we have emissions from fossil fuels. Yes, that's about 2/3 of the answer. But the remaining third is industrial chemistry, like cement outgassing CO2, for example, or our landfills outgassing methane, for example, or agriculture and land use. So it is way more than fossil fuels, and to solve climate change entirely, we've got to look across a whole bunch of different sectors, and they're all really, really important. Now I think the animations will work again. Sorry about that. We also have to recognize that climate change will touch multiple economic sectors, the things we do in society that produce these greenhouse gases. Bernadette showed a different version of these slides before, but basically around the world, producing electricity is around 23% of what causes climate change. Agriculture is about 22%, industry is about 23%. These are all about the same in size today. Transportation in the US is a much bigger number, but globally it's about 15%. Building operations about 5%, and then other energy. This includes refining oil, fugitive emissions, flaring of natural gas, and so on, is the last 10%. And we know very, very detailed information on like where this carbon is. And we can actually show you down to, very detailed kind of assessments of subsectors and even geographically exactly where these emissions are. So we kind of know the nature of the problem. It's multiple economic sectors, multiple gases, and multiple things that produce these greenhouse gases. It isn't just fossil fuels and CO2. You got to take the bigger view. That's one thing we have to know, is just kind of where does this stuff come from? The other big scientific principle we have to focus on is the importance of time. Time is by far the most important variable when it comes to stopping climate change, but it's the one we get wrong most often. It's so amazing how often technologists, investors, and politicians get this wrong. So this is what the basic problem is. We have to look at these two curves. One is the greenhouse gas emissions. This is the annual production of pollution that we're putting up into the sky that's been building up, causing a warmer and warmer planet over time. That's the red curve. For the last 50 years, greenhouse gas emissions continued to rise for the most part over the decades. And now we're at about that red dot where we are today. If we were to extrapolate the last few decades out into the future, you might expect it to keep going up. That's bad. That's going from bad to worse. In fact, we don't want to do that. And of course, what we have to do is just the opposite. We have to drastically cut greenhouse gas emissions, especially in the next decade, decade and a half, and keep cutting them all the way into the middle of the century. But even if we do this, even if we can pull off going from a bad direction to a good direction, kind of bend the curve, if you will, even we do that with Herculean effort, we're not going to cut all greenhouse gas emissions to zero in every country, in every economic sector, in every possible way. It's probably going to be some emissions still out there in the future that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. That's where the idea of carbon removal, the green line, comes in. The idea is that maybe we could remove a little bit of that pollution and bury it in different places using either biology, like trees, or using machines that suck carbon out of the air and bury it into rocks, essentially. Well, the problem with that is right now, carbon removal is zero on this planet. Despite 50 years of talking about it and billions of dollars invested in this, it hasn't even become less than 1/1,000,000th of 1% of our global emissions. So it's effectively zero. Even though we've spent a lot of time and rhetoric on this, it hasn't moved the needle at all. But we're going to have to. So between now and 2050, we're going to have to grow carbon removal 7 orders of magnitude, add 7 zeros to these numbers to make it scale up to these gigaton range, these billions of tons range that will be needed to kind of close that last gap of the emissions we didn't cut by 2050. And that's where we get into what's called net zero, where we cut most of the emissions and we remove the last little bit. But here's the kicker. Time is crucial. We have to act right now because climate change is a cumulative problem. The pollution in the atmosphere has been building up for about 150 years. It didn't happen in 1 year, it happened over a century and a half. So the solutions also need to accumulate and build up their effect over time. So this is how this works. If we cut emissions this decade by that much, it means the whole blue area was never emitted into the atmosphere. It's the area under the curve that matters, the cumulative impact, the integral from a math point of view that really matters. So cutting emissions in the 2020s is critical in the 2020s, But those emissions cuts keep paying off in the 2030s and 2040s and beyond. That's the total amount of carbon we avoided putting in the atmosphere, causing even more climate change. And then we have emissions cuts in the 2030s, and we have some more in the 2040s. But by the 2040s, the time to have a big impact has already run out pretty much. That's why the 2020 solutions are so important to us, as early action is not only crucial in bending the curve, it also accumulates over time. This is also why carbon removal is going to be a relatively small part of the equation. Not only is it zero today, it's going to take decades to scale up to anything meaningful to the planet. And even if it did so, it's only going to really start kicking into the 2040s. Its total cumulative impact will be small. So it turns out cutting emissions is about 96% of the job. Starting in the 2020s, it will be 76% of the entire job is emissions cuts starting this decade or so. Carbon removal, even though it gets a lot of buzz right now, is really only about 4% of the total solution when you do the math of the area under the curve. What do we learn here is that there's a time value of solutions. Just like a time value of money, early money accumulates and builds up towards your retirement, for example. Same thing with solutions. The earlier we deploy them, the longer they can work in the atmosphere. That's why a lot of people get this wrong, like Bill Gates and others, who talk about far away high-tech solutions that never seem to arrive. They don't have any impact because they're only going to have a few years to turn on. If we wait for fusion to be our solution, or modular nuclear, or big carbon removal to be a big part of the solution, you're not going to see it, because every year you wait, you have to discount the impact on the atmosphere. This is why near-term solutions, things that are available now, low-tech solutions maybe, are by far the most impactful. So we have a saying at Drawdown that now is more important than new, and time is more important than tech. So we have to focus on time really appropriately. We also have to know where to focus geographically, because climate solutions shouldn't be applied uniformly. There are kind of 80-20 rules where we could get 80% of the answer by focusing on 20% of the problem. For example, in the United States, about 70% of the power plant emissions in the US come from 25% of the power plants. So those are the first ones we want to retire. Or 30% of the leaking methane in the United States comes from 1% of the natural gas infrastructure. Or in the Amazon, about 70% of the biomass of carbon in trees is in 25% of the forest. So we can focus on key parts of the planet to get the kind of biggest impact in the shortest amount of time. This is why we need to focus and be much more strategic with climate solutions, not only in time, but in space. We also have to recognize that climate change isn't happening in a vacuum. It's happening alongside many other problems, including equity and justice. We've looked, for example, at how climate solutions on the left can create enormous co-benefits to people, especially in low and middle income countries, people who live under $2 a day in extreme poverty. Climate solutions might be the key to not only helping with climate change, but unlocking income and work and food security, water and sanitation, education and healthcare, gender equality, and so on. So how can climate solutions do more than just address climate change? Can they help us with other problems as well? I think yes. And then also we need to go out and build out our solutions. As we do so, we have to start with kind of a larger portfolio of what kinds of things do we need to do? I showed you this already. We have to cut emissions drastically across the places they're being emitted, like electricity, food and agriculture, industry, and so on. And we can double click and find out exactly where the subsectors are. This is basically most of the work we need to do. We also can cut emissions indirectly by investing in people, especially indigenous communities and women and girls around the world. By investing in these communities, we find that this bends future curves in like deforestation or demography or economic development in ways that reduce emissions in the future. So this is kind of a people first, climate second kind of set of solutions here, and then carbon removal to round out the rest. So that's kind of how we should design the portfolio of what we need to do to stop climate change. And this is really critical. And then within that, we can find the individual solutions that work today. And at Project Drawdown, we have a whole library of them, about 100 kind of drawdown approved solutions that are available today that are economically, technologically, and scientifically credible. These are solutions that work now and are effective. If they're not on this list, they're not effective and they're not going to help us anytime soon. So we look at this, whether it's in electricity, all the solutions that are available here, in agriculture, in industry, in transportation, and so on. We can find lots of solutions in this portfolio to go out there and deploy today. The other great thing is we've estimated the cost of these solutions and found, really interestingly, 80% of them have a negative cost compared to the world where we just kept burning fossil fuels. These save money compared to our current infrastructure and energy systems. They make new money. They're efficiency measures. They're renewable energy, which is cheaper than fossil fuels. So compared to our business as usual world, this is a world where we created enormous wealth by investing in new technologies for at least 80% of the solutions. That last 20% might require some subsidies or new technologies that drive down the cost. But 80% of them today are already cost effective, would make the world money. And that's a really, really good thing. Well, here's how we're doing so far. This is what we call the kind of the drawdown portfolio. We've designed this portfolio of what we need to do to stop climate change. And we can compare that to how the world's spending its money on climate solutions down below, whether it's in philanthropy. That's doing a pretty good job. Venture capital, unfortunately, is not, even though this is a huge pile of money, about 90 billion a year, but 2/3 of it went into just one category, electric cars and scooters. That's maybe where the money returns are for venture capitalists. It's also where Elon Musk was, so everybody wants to follow him, but it's not the portfolio that would best stop climate change. There's a big disconnect in the private sector we need to fix. And then we can look at the federal government, which is going to be spending more money from the Inflation Reduction Act on climate solutions. That's pretty heavily weighted towards electricity, which makes sense in some ways, because that might be the key to later unlocking solutions in industry, transportation, and buildings, is having a cleaner grid. But you have to put the money in industry, transport, and buildings in order to realize them. So I would argue this is a little bit imbalanced in the long term, but a good start for climate solutions at the federal level. But we're going to need all of these different sources of money, private, philanthropic, and government, to really stop climate change. But we always, always, always need to follow the science, because we can't waste one more day or one more dollar on the things that don't work. So just like Bernadette was showing how science can guide us in understanding the climate crisis, it's also what we need to do to guide us in solving the climate crisis as well, in putting the resources where they're effective. In closing up, though, here's my ask of all of you. I hope we can work together, because we need your imagination, your amplification, your reach, your platforms, your expertise, and your insights. And I'm still convinced we can build a better, more sustainable and equitable world, but we need to work collaboratively. Here's how you can reach us at drawdown.org. We have all the resources I just showed you available for free on our website. You can follow us on social, also reach out to our comms team if you ever need any help. But also reach out to me, and that's how you can contact me on email or on social. And finally, I just want to urge us to remember we live in the most incredible moment in human history, and it's a beautiful moment, because we're the first generations in human history that can imagine a beautiful, amazing world. We could be just 1 or 2 generations away from a world that is actually sustainable, where we get it right on climate and biodiversity. We could live in a world that eradicates extreme poverty and illiteracy and most infectious disease. We could live in a world that was more equitable and just than any in previous history. So yes, there's a lot of doom and gloom out there and a lot in the media, but I also want to remind us that this is a beautiful moment that we could seize and build a better world. And by working together, I think we can really get there. So with that, I'll stop here and look forward to the next set of questions and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you. That was really both very informative and, I dare say, a little bit inspirational there at the end as well. So we have several questions, lots of questions. Lots of questions have been answered in the chat, lots of activity in the chat, which is wonderful. I'm going to start with just a really specific question, Bernadette, back to you about when you said you had mostly US focused slides up there. We had a question from a journalist in Canada. What about data and information that is not US specific at Climate Central? I'm assuming the answer is yes, there's lots of that.
There's some, there's not enough.
Okay.
Historically, a lot of the Climate Matters program was US focused. We've done some projects with global TV weather presenters. This program, for those who don't know, started with meteorologists. And so we did work with global TV weather presenters. Data is different in different countries. The access to it's different countries, the reliability of different countries is very varied. So we don't have as much in that way. Now, that doesn't mean that some of our things aren't, right? So the attribution tool I was showing you, the Climate Shift Index, that is global. That is something anyone, anywhere can access. And so that's up and running. Also, our sea level rise work, that's a global tool also. And then we've done individual projects in different countries. So there's not as much in Canada, but with what's going on with those fires right now, sadly, the extra heat that we put into our system is the basis for so many of the changes we see. So you can use that attribution tool to look at the heat. And it's been like a bright red spot over Western Canada for a while right now. So it's a tough one.
Okay, great, thank you. So one of the questions that I'm just going to read it. I'd love to hear from the presenters about the impact that they see on the slow progress on solutions, showing for carbon removal projects, for example, or the lack of political will. Can we science the shit out of creating ideas, but what do we do with these sticking points and implementation? And then I would add to that, and what role does the media have to play in moving that conversation forward more quickly at the speed that we need that to happen?
I can throw a few thoughts in there and love to hear Bernadette's thoughts too, if that would be helpful. So I think about this a lot, and there are a few things that people don't realize. Actually, we've made enormous progress already. There are 45 countries in the world that are cutting their emissions quite substantially, even while growing their economy. And you're living in one of them right now. The United States is, though most people don't know this, we actually peaked our greenhouse gas emissions back in 2007. And we've cut them through the Obama administration. And yes, the Trump administration, didn't matter. We kept cutting them and have been cutting them to about 21% since then. We actually beat the goals of the cap and trade bill that Obama never passed. We beat the goals of the Kyoto protocols Washington never approved. And we were already on track to cut emissions by 30% by the end of the decade without any government action at all. And now, thanks to the Biden administration stepping on the gas, or pardon the pun, we're going to be cutting maybe down to 40 to 45%, thanks to the federal government finally stepping up, mainly by investing capital. And into solutions, making them cheaper and accelerating them. But there are 45 other countries doing the same thing, all Western capitalist democracies. And that, by the way, does include trade with China. It is not because we outsourced our emissions to other countries. That's not true. We've already adjusted for that and can account for that data. So the Western world has already started to decarbonize and has for decades. Britain, the UK has cut its emissions by 40% since its peak in the 1990s, though nobody reports that. So there's some really actual great momentum already starting. We just need to accelerate it drastically, admittedly. But the next step is going to be China. China's still increasing their emissions, but about to plateau. And then I think theirs will go down. And then followed after that will be India and other countries across the world. So this is a big global game, but we have seen progress. It's just nobody talks about it. This is a job a lot of people on this call could help with, is to get a little bit more balance between the negative news on climate, which is 99% of it, and less than 1% that currently talks about solutions. Could that be 10%, please? In reality, it's more like 50-50, but could we please talk more about solutions and the great people who are working on these things? Because if we want that part of the garden to grow, we do need to water it a little. So there are solutions. We are leveling off global emissions. We are seeing drastic improvements and tipping points, good ones, on solar, on wind, on batteries, on EVs, on LED lighting, on a lot of technologies that are getting bigger, faster, cheaper than anybody ever predicted. So I'm actually pretty hopeful that we can pull this off if we really start to accelerate now. But the problem is we wasted every window of opportunity we had for delay. We did all the do-over time. All the mulligans have been used. We have to stick the landing now. I personally, getting to the second part of the question, is it political will? What the heck is that? It's about power and money. Let's be honest. There's no actual policy making anymore. It's a big battle over power and money and egos. So we have to win at that game. So it's going to be a battle in the marketplace. It's like, capital will go to where it needs to go. The private sector is spending far more than the world's governments on climate solutions. That's who's going to lead us here. Government can follow behind and do a lot of good here, but don't look to Washington or the UN to lead us on climate solutions. They at best will follow and add on. But if we've waited 30 years for leadership there, and it never came. So we have to follow where things are happening. That said, I'm very happy the Biden administration has invested in in climate solutions, but it pales in comparison to what the private sector was already doing. But government funding can do things other funding can't. But the other thing too, to notice how the federal government talked about this. The Green New Deal was dead on arrival, but the Inflation Reduction Act, talking in kitchen table terms, real Americans can understand. That's really great. It talks about reducing the cost of energy, helping create jobs, making communities more equitable and safer and cleaner and healthier. Don't talk about abstractions on climate change when you want solutions. Talk about real world benefits to the 98% of Americans who don't think climate change is a top issue. They might believe it, they might be concerned about it, but climate change never gets more than 2% in the Gallup poll of a top issue facing the nation. Talk about climate solutions in terms of jobs, equity and justice, health, security, things that everybody cares about in real terms. And then you start to see the needle move. It's just a fascinating kind of disconnect in climate communication right now.
Yeah, I'll add just a couple of thoughts on there too, because this is where I can't stress enough what Jonathan said about time. I mean, this is where it gets really complicated because it's such a big thing, right? On different time scales, our greenhouse gases, there's several of them on different time scales. They last in our atmosphere on different time scales. So the word time really comes out here. And there's a couple of ways to look at this. One is the overall picture of we were on a path of about 5 or 6 degrees Celsius of warming. Before the Paris Agreement, that was very much where we were headed. Now we've bent that curve. So there are changes that are happening in playing out all the ways that Jonathan just said. The thing is, though, it's not enough to get to the goals we want to get to. So it's two things at once. It is happening. There are some great, amazing stories out there. There are some innovators who are rocking it. There are people leading the way, but we need more. And so the theme we've been using a lot this year internally is accelerate and supersize. We just need to just really accelerate this and supersize it, because we're already seeing people's lives be lost from some of these events. So when we put it in that framing of 1.5 degrees Celsius, it's this global goal to keep us on a general path or try to bend that curve even more, whether we're 1.6, 1.4, it doesn't mean everything survives, nothing does. It's every 10th of a degree really matters. We know that the impacts just escalate with every 10th of a degree. And so we just need to bend that curve faster, but it's happening. And to Jonathan's point too, is it takes all of us, and we've waited so long that we really need all of it. There's no one direct way to change this. We do need, with some of the bills that have been passed lately, they can set a path for then where our private sector goes, and then general public can follow in that path too. So it takes all of us. And so it's hard to summarize that because I know we're running short on time, but the biggest thing is time, as he was saying, is we are making big changes in beautiful ways. And we've done this before, right? Like now we're all addicted to these phones. There was a time when we didn't have it. Now it's bigger than our computer, right? And there was a time when we went from horses to all driving cars in less than a decade. So like we can do big things when we start doing this. We've wasted a lot of time, so we need to do it even faster.
All right, I'm gonna pull one. I mean, I know that both of you are looking into the chat, so if there's something that you want to particularly answer, you can go for it. But a question that I wanted to just throw out there is, since we're talking about, how to report on and increase awareness about solutions to the climate crisis, we've got adaptation and mitigation and resilience. And how do those three? What are your thoughts on, how to talk about those as different types of solutions? There was a period of time when we moved from talking about mitigation to this is here. We need to talk about adaptation and resiliency. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean,
it all.
yeah, it's all the above. I guess, more of all that, please. Again, it's really, really bizarre that, 99% of the coverage on climate is about the disaster porn. I know that's part of the media business. If it bleeds, it leads kind of thing, but it's not helpful. It's scaring people, causing climate anxiety, just when we need people to step up and work on solutions. So, I would urge more balance on problems and solutions. We didn't just talk about COVID as a problem. We also talked about vaccines and solutions and things we can do. Same here. We need a balanced approach. And then within the solutions, yes, mitigation is the ultimate solution. It stops the problem from getting worse, but we will need adaptation and resilience along the way, of course, too. So more balance, please. But I know how hard that is in today's media ecosystem, but also the political and activist ecosystem that surrounds it. It's kind of feeding itself. We have this narrative of like, the world is going to hell. Those bad people are to blame. And if we get angry enough, we're going to beat them. Politicians say it, media says this, activists play into this, and we're all kind of in a death spiral to nowhere with this. I would really like to encourage a different narrative of like, hey, the world is amazing and beautiful, and we can fix our problems. The solutions we need are staring us in the face. They're right here, and they're going to make the world better. And if we actually collaborated, we could do this and build a better world in the process. I wish I heard that more. Martin Luther King didn't go around shouting, I have a nightmare. He talked about a world that we wanted, a world we could aspire to and collaborate for and get to someday. We didn't get to his dream yet, but for climate change, we need to do that. These are solutions. They will make the world better. They make us better. And they're right here in front of us. And it just kills me every day we don't talk about what we could be doing and inspiring people to do more. Because as Bernadette said, it's game on time here, folks. And we need to accelerate and supersize what we've already started and get there. And we're going to be so glad that we did.
And we need it all, Catherine. At this point, we need it all. There is a good perspective that people use, though, too, of a tub, right? Filling with water. You need to shut off that water. That's the mitigation and stopping the emissions while also draining it. But if you just keep draining it and don't shut off the water, it's still going to overflow. So we need it both at this point because that tub is pretty full. However, there's some amazing adaptation and stories going on. The beauty of those, though, is they are so local. So it's hard sometimes to scale something that we do for heat in Phoenix with something that we're doing in, say, Philadelphia. But there's a lot that we can learn, and there's so many stories to be told. And as Jonathan was saying, though, you can do that in a whole story arc. You can hit on the challenges and the impacts while also bringing on what some of the adaptation strategies are and mitigation strategies.
Great. Thank you. Thank you both. We are at time. Thank you very much to all the participants and the wonderful questions. There will be a recording of today's session that I will send out to everyone that registered, whether you attended or were here or not. If we didn't get to your questions, I'm going to do my best to get answers to those and send those back out to you. I just posted a link into the chat that the SJN, we're launching a peer reporting, climate solutions reporting network. If you're interested in that, fill out that form and I will be in touch with you in about a month. I think you've got my email address to reach out, and just thank you very much for a great conversation, and get out there and write some stories about how we're going to tackle this crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.